Advisory Group and our welcome everyone to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group, and I also teach history at Suffolk University. And our guest this week is Asheesh Kapur Siddique, who is an assistant professor of history at UMass Boston and really a scholar of the British Empire and archives in the British Empire. So Asheesh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Bob, and thanks so much to the Revolution 250 team for all the hard work that goes into putting this on.
Well, thank you. And so you're right now writing a book, or you're, I guess, finishing a book about archives in the British Empire.
I actually submitted it to the press just a couple of months ago, so I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the readers' report. Right. So hopefully that'll come back soon, and it should. With any luck, will be published sometime early next year.
Right, and it's about archives. It's actually an extraordinary thing because we all look at the documents that are being issued by different British components of the British government and people on this side, and what you're actually looking at are the documents themselves and kind of the paper trail and how they're generating this. And their interest in maintaining an archive. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? It's an interesting idea.
So I think that today, when I think that today we think of, as historians and then as the public, of archives in two ways. I think as historians we think of archives as places where we go to do research about things that happened in the past, and not necessarily things that are per se relevant to today. And I think that perhaps when the public thinks of archives, I'm not sure if they thought of them a lot, but I think in recent years, with the controversies over presidential papers in both the Trump and Biden administration, they might think of archives as places where governments might go to hide things from people. But in the early modern period, I think both of those ideas were present, along with a third one, which is that across early modern Europe, in both England, France, and across early modern Europe, administrators and rulers thought that there was an intimate relationship between what knowledge of the past could tell them about how to govern in the present day. And so they thought that by going to archives, they could access both the wisdom and the precedents of past decision makers, past rulers, and that they could use that paper, quite literally, or parchment in some cases. Parchment, your readers probably know the distinction, but paper in the early modern period was made actually not really from trees, but usually from rags, from old clothing, and parchment was made from animal skin. And they thought that they could use these documents to illuminate how they should govern in the present day, or how they should, or how they might be able to justify decisions that they were going to make anyway. And so the idea, in some sense, was that a statement of fact or truth about matters relating to government was thought to be inseparable from the idea of having a document that you could cite or convince people actually existed to back it up.
Right. And actually, we tend to forget that at this moment when we're thinking about the revolution, the British Empire is actually just beginning to realize it has an empire to govern.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things about that is that, today, I think perhaps if we were to go to, the National Archives in D.C. or perhaps an institution like the Massachusetts Historical Society, anyone who is interested in doing research or consulting the documents can easily go in and you can apply for a reader's card, and as long as you agree to certain regulations, like don't bring your coffee into the reading room, you're allowed as a member of the public to go and access these documents. But in the early modern period, things were completely different. The public had no access to these documents because they were considered to be the privileged possession of the monarch. And
Hmm.
so the idea was that even if it was an administrator who created it, it was an administrator who was working under the
Hmm.
king or queen or sovereign. And so the sovereign possessed these documents as their privilege,
Hmm.
and as their kind of secret store of wisdom about governing decisions. And they
Interesting.
protected these archives quite intimately, and they were very restrictive about who they allowed access to. One of the
Hmm.
interesting things that your readers might be interested in learning is that, in fact, in the early modern period, certainly in England, and then in Britain, well, the kind of the term that was used to refer to these governmental papers was actually called state papers, and so
Right.
they were conceived of as being papers that belong to the state. And in
Hmm.
fact, the idea of calling them public records or national archives is very much a mid 19th century
Hmm.
invention. And so, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation research and the research for this book, um, I was able to go to a building called the National Archives that in a former time had been called the Public Records Office, but
Hmm.
even in an earlier time had been called the State Paper Office, and where I would have not easily, especially as a foreigner,
Right. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
had easy access to those state secrets.
Interesting. And you also talk about how the different entities, the Board of Trade has its own kind of collection, and then these other institutions within the British government are creating their own archival sources, really to and not as a way of saying, hey, let's make this accessible to the general
Right.
public or to researchers.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, so in this period that I'm looking at in the 17th century and the 18th century, there are we can kind of talk about this thing called the state or the British
Hmm.
government, but
Yeah.
actually there are so many different bodies that are involved in what today we might think of as kind of the behaviors that constitute government, like
Right.
raising taxes,
Hmm.
passing laws, administering judicial decisions, and they all some of them are under the control of the British monarchy, but they maintain separate archives, and in theory they're supposed to work together,
Hmm.
but in practice. They sometimes have competing
Right.
agendas, and they can
Yeah.
hide documents from each other.
Hmm.
And then the other extraordinary thing about this period is that this is also an era in the 17th and 18th century where across the British Empire, including in North America, in what becomes North America, there are also governing bodies that are not really quite part of the state, but have
Hmm.
enormous kinds of political power, like corporations.
Right.
And so I write in the book a great deal about how in in Asia, the British Empire takes shape not so much as a state-run endeavor, but as a corporate-run
Right.
endeavor by a corporation called the East India
Right.
Company, which was created by the monarchy, but
Hmm.
which maintains its own separate archive, quite
Hmm.
separate from that of the Board of Trade and the
Hmm.
Secretary of State, in which the East India Company is also very concerned about protecting not just from the public, but
Hmm.
also from other entities of the state that might want to investigate
Right.
its activities.
Yeah. Because it does get investigated quite a bit.
Exactly,
Yeah.
especially in the 18th century, where a lot of the investigations that go into it, especially listeners may know of the famous trial of Warren
Right.
Hastings, who was the Governor General of Bengal, who in the late 18th century was investigated by Parliament for abuses and various administrative abuses, and in that context, one of the things that Parliament does is that it does what today we would call kind of subpoenaing
Hmm.
documents
Hmm.
from the East India Company and demanding that it provide the
Hmm.
um, uh, provide investigators with written evidence
Right.
that then the people who prosecute Hastings cite and invoke as evidence of his crimes and wrongdoing.
Wow. Was the company keeping like duplicate records in London and in Calcutta or in Delhi? Was it or
Absolutely.
Bombay?
So
Yeah.
it had, I mean, in some ways, in kind of a parallel to the way that these archives worked in the Atlantic world.
Mm-hmm.
There was both a kind of a centralized archive in London at the company headquarters, sort of in parallel to the multiple archives of, say, the Secretary of State and the
Mm-hmm.
Board of Trade, who had various jurisdictions over activities in the Atlantic world.
Mm-hmm.
And then, sort of in the same way that different colonies, the governments of different colonies in North America and the Caribbean, also maintained copies, or in some cases, their own papers,
Mm-hmm.
both governors and legislative assemblies. In South Asia, the company had set up in the 17th century different factories
Mm-hmm.
where its traders would administer the
Mm-hmm.
trade in local areas, and
Yeah.
so there were factories throughout South Asia as well as
Mm-hmm.
into East Asia, modern day
Mm-hmm.
Indonesia, and all of those factories maintain their own records, which
Mm-hmm.
nominally, in parallel to the way that a colony like Massachusetts or New Jersey was supposed to send back copies
Mm-hmm.
to the administrators in
Right.
London, so too were these factories
Mm-hmm.
also.
Okay. We're talking with Asheesh Kapur Siddique from the University of Massachusetts, talking about archives. And actually, as you were talking, 1984 made a lot more sense because Winston Smith has to go into the archives
Yes.
and change all of these records when,
Yes.
Oceania goes to war with East Asia instead of
Right.
Eurasia. So who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the
Absolutely.
present controls the past.
Absolutely.
And
And that is, I think, one of the reasons why, even today, we are seeing all of this back and forth in the news, and we're seeing kind of, I think, the desire um, of presidents to attempt to control their own
sure.
archive and control their own account of the history of their administration, and seeing actually an enormous amount of effort and stakes in how political elites and
Mm-hmm.
leadership try to not just control what information is available to the public during their administration, but
Mm.
also the legacy and the
Right.
history and how
Yeah.
historians may come to think about and imagine it.
That's interesting. So this is not a new phenomenon.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
In many ways, it's a very early modern
yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
persisting
Yeah.
into the modern era.
Yeah. Yeah. You've written also a lot about the idea of a written constitution as opposed to we all know there's no written British constitution, but you make the point that there is actually a lot of writing that goes into creating the British constitution.
Yeah, I've been interested in kind of a project that is coming out of the um, of the book, and is kind of becoming a newer project about how the idea of a written constitution, imagined as a kind of as a single document,
Mm-hmm.
which is the sort that we're familiar with in the U.S. and increasingly throughout both the Atlantic world and beyond, how that idea came into being. Because it's interesting that one of the things I found in my research is that even in the early modern period, when people talked about a constitution, and they often linked it with documents, but they linked it to the multiplicity of documents that might be involved
Mm-hmm.
in making a government work. So both so there was this sense that a constitution was unwritten, in the sense that it wasn't confined to a single document, but at the same time manifested in the written words of leaders, of sovereigns, and in the British Empire, in the early modern British Empire, a lot of a hugely important kind of interest and endeavor was in the copying and the circulation of legal opinions, because lawyers across the British Empire, in order to and magistrates and people who were enforcing the law, needed to know what different judges in a common law system. Judges are very important in making laws. Had decided. And all of those opinions had to circulate in writing. And so there was this huge and enormous kind of endeavor of both initially and even well into the 18th century, transcribing by hand judicial decisions and then sending them around the British Empire. And then a bit later into the 18th century, increasingly printing these decisions. And so when the American Revolution happens, a lot of that kind of what today we would call kind of common law decision making remains extremely relevant to how law develops in the U.S. But we also have the creation of these single document constitutions, both at the state level and at the federal level, that in some ways build off of the kind of charter documents that the monarchy, especially way back in the 17th century, issued to colonists who were coming to a place like Massachusetts or Virginia or New Jersey, but that at the same time, the kind of the founders and the American revolutionaries also want to say are quite different from these older documents, in part because they want to define themselves as a new kind of state. And so there's this tension between a kind of innovation and continuity that I'm really interested in trying to tease out in this other project.
It's really interesting. We're talking with Asheesh Kapur Siddique from the University of Massachusetts about his work on archives. So what drew you to looking at the archive itself, or at the paper itself, as the thing?
Yeah, I actually started. So this book started as a dissertation on kind of a pretty abstract idea. I was interested in sort of political knowledge in the early modern period, and I sort of decided to go to the UK National Archives, which is in the outskirts of London first, to try to figure out, get some kind of a base of sources to think about how to write a dissertation. And I kind of I was thinking of going to other places after that, and I did, but in some ways I never left, because I was just so curious about how all of the paper that was in there got there, and how it got sort of arranged in and how it might have been used in the past. And it took a long time for me to in some sense learn how to read the archive in a way that wasn't just about getting information from the documents, but also asking about how they were created and how they were arranged in the past. I think oftentimes, increasingly, especially these days, historians are often working with online or database versions of documents, and that is amazing, and it helps us do a lot of kinds of research that might not be possible otherwise, because we can see many sources together in aggregate. We can use search techniques that allow us to see how words or ideas change over time. But one of the things that I think we can lose is that sense of the materiality of paper and parchment and all of the stuff of the binding of documents. And as I was in the archives, I really kind of became really curious about how that was managed. Because
Mm.
although I think when we use digital archives, we can sometimes forget that there's actually a huge archives are expensive to
Oh,
maintain.
yeah.
They take up
Yes.
huge amounts of space,
Right.
and um, they aren't cheap. There is
No.
a cost to
Hmm.
preserving information, and so in some sense, I wanted to ask I want to kind of make strange the question of why
Hmm.
a state would actually be interested in
Yeah.
making that
Hmm.
in paying that cost to
Hmm.
begin with, especially in the early modern
Right.
period. And so
Right.
that led me to ask these
Interesting.
questions.
Interesting. Now, Ashish, do you see other countries at the same time doing this, or is this a particularly English thing? So it's an early
It's very much, I think, an early modern thing,
Mm.
and it's in a kind of a big, broad sense. I think it's related to, broadly speaking, the rise of the early modern state
Hmm.
in the at the end of the medieval period. So,
Hmm.
kind of in the in the 15th and 16th centuries. So, um, to paint somewhat of a broad brush, in the medieval period, many of the administrative functions that we would associate with the state, like for
Hmm.
example, collecting taxes or managing, say, disputes over the ownership of land and property, was actually done by ecclesiastical institutions.
Hmm.
So the church,
Right.
in both England as well as in continental Europe.
Hmm.
And these ecclesiastical institutions collected and maintained huge archives of their records.
Hmm.
But once kings and queens and monarchs increasingly tried to take back or to seize power from these ecclesiastical institutions, they wanted to build up their own archives, and
Hmm.
that kind of process is especially kind of is occurs in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries.
Hmm.
Incidentally, at the same time as these monarchs, in part to augment their power domestically, are also engaging in
Hmm.
overseas trade and expansion. And
Hmm.
in England, um, the kind of the key event that is both important for the augmentation of the powers of the monarchy, and actually, incidentally, also for the creation of a kind of a state archive, is the Reformation, when
Hmm.
Henry VIII breaks from what today we know as the Catholic Church, but
Right.
was
Yeah.
actually just the church,
The
because there
church.
was
Right.
kind of one church in
Yes.
in Europe, and forms his own church.
Hmm.
And at the same time, which is a well-known story, but what listeners may also not know is that at the same time as he does that, he also sends his sort of loyal servants and administrators to go around England and seize the records of local churches, and
Hmm.
tries to consolidate them in a under his control. And he
Wow.
creates he and his successors, such as
Hmm.
Queen Elizabeth, begin to build up a their own kind of central state archive called the State
Hmm.
Paper Office,
Hmm.
as
Interesting.
part of this process of trying to unite secular power and ecclesiastical power in their own hands. And so, in some sense, you might say that in early modern Europe, power is conceived of as partly control over not just control over territory, but also
Hmm.
control over information about it.
Right. It's fascinating. I was just thinking too of our state archives at Columbia Point in
Yes.
Dorchester, and one of the first documents they have officially in the archives is the Declaration of Independence, a copy
Yes.
sent by John Hancock saying to put this in the archives, to create
Yes.
an archive, seeing that this is a new venture. I mean, they did have colonial records that I guess had been in the
Right.
province. So,
And
so,
it's fascinating, because I think one of the things that we see happening during the Revolution is that um, the 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 American revolutionaries are very cognizant of this entanglement between um, state power and the existence of documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And even one of the things that they're interested in doing is gaining recognition, right, of their
Right.
declared independent state
Mm-hmm.
as a state from the rest of the world. And
Mm-hmm.
so the very decision to write a Declaration of Independence and then to publish it and then
Mm-hmm.
to try to dispatch it to other states in Europe
Mm-hmm.
to gain recognition is in some sense, I think, part of this early modern idea where the legitimacy of a state and the existence of documentation
Mm-hmm.
about it are tied together. And so
Mm-hmm.
the revolutionaries are very much, I think, very cognizant of that, and they are playing into this tendency and trying to say, we're not part of the British Empire anymore. Those
Mm-hmm.
documents are what legitimize us. Our own documents are what
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
legitimize us, and so we want to send them abroad and hopefully convince other Britain's rivals on the continent,
Right.
such as France, to recognize us as such.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're talking with Asheesh Kapur Siddique from the University of Massachusetts, talking about the function of archives in the early modern period and in state formation. I just wanted to go back briefly to India, because there it becomes part of the empire. And you mentioned the East India Company has its records, and also how England is trying to transmit its sense of law to different parts of
Yes.
the empire. So how is that working in Bengal or in India generally?
Well, it's really interesting. So when the East India Company is kind of comes into India at a moment when the reigning empire on the South Asian
Mm-hmm.
subcontinent is the Mughal Empire, and the
Mm-hmm.
Mughal Empire actually has its own version of written law, and it has an elaborate and complicated administrative system.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, what's interesting is that the East India Company, especially the East India Company administrators who actually go to India to run the factories um, and to administer empire on the ground, begin to think of the project of building kind of an empire in India, especially in the 1750s and 1760s, after the East India Company wins a number of victories over the Mughal ruler in Bengal, and actually, as part of winning those battles, actually comes to hold it actually comes to be the office holder of a number of Mughal
Mm-hmm.
imperial
Mm-hmm.
titles, especially of um, the office of Nawab, which is kind of like the land administrator of
Mm-hmm.
Bengal. And in doing so, company administrators in India decide that actually the way to run this empire is not to necessarily bring English common law to India, but
Mm-hmm.
instead to try to administer India based on the what they call kind of the ancient Mughal constitution, or the ancient
Mm-hmm.
constitution of India, ancient Indian laws, which
Mm-hmm.
in some ways they are inventing, of course, but which
Mm-hmm.
they are trying to derive from Sanskrit legal texts, from Hindu legal texts,
Mm-hmm.
which they commission uh, um, uh, former Mughal legal officers to translate into English.
Interesting.
And so there's this idea that rather than, in some sense, impose English common law onto India, what the company wants to do in this immediate period is
Mm-hmm.
to kind of revivify uh, a an ancient Indian form of law.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so this project actually creates a lot of conflict within the company between administrators on the ground who kind of say, well, you know what, we are here in India and we know how to run this empire better than you people who are in London.
Yeah.
And people in London who say, hey, well, you know what, we actually think that this older system that we've been talking about a little bit earlier about kind of central
Mm-hmm.
metropolitan
Sure.
archives of empire being the authorizing
Mm-hmm.
body of documents, that should just kind of continue. And
Yeah.
so this conflict sort of plays out in
Mm-hmm.
the 1780s and 1790s, but ultimately for a number of complicated reasons that I kind of explore a little bit in the book, it sort of begins to give way to a very different idea, both in Britain and then across the empire, of how an empire should be run. That is actually about saying, well, you know what? Actually, these archives aren't so useful at all,
Hmm.
and actually, it would be better if we could gather information about what people are doing right now in the present day, and using that as the basis of trying to come up with laws and policies. And so there's this
Hmm.
move, increasingly in the early 19th century, to privilege investment in this a new science of statistics, of
Hmm.
quantitative
Interesting.
information, data gathering
Right.
about supposedly things that are happening right now. About,
Right.
say,
This is
like,
this is when Malthus goes to India, right? So,
exactly,
yeah. Yeah.
exactly. Um, and that in many ways begins to um, shift archives away from this sense that they are part of the governing
Mm-hmm.
apparatus of the state, to something that I think we increasingly are familiar with today, to the idea that they are actually history, and that
Yeah.
one of
Yeah.
the reasons why states think that it's okay to open them up to researchers is that they
Right.
don't think that
Yeah.
there's anything
Yeah.
hiding there that could
Interesting.
embarrass them.
Right. Interesting. Interesting. You have an article coming out soon about William Jones, Esquire,
Yes.
who is one of the. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? It's an interesting character.
Yeah, William Jones is a very interesting a person, a kind of a polymath of the late 18th
Yeah.
century, who um, uh, was one of the first people in England to seriously try to study Indian languages,
Mm-hmm.
and who, in the process of studying Sanskrit and Bengali and other Indian languages, produced a number of translations of Indian texts, including Indian legal texts. So Jones was initially trained as a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
and he was kind of one of the first people to working both on behalf of the East India Company, to begin this endeavor of kind of translating Indian legal texts
Mm-hmm.
into English,
Yeah.
in part to try to facilitate their use by the company,
Mm-hmm.
by company administrators who didn't necessarily know any South Asian
Right.
languages, in order to try to administer this. And at the same time, Jones is also somebody who is interested in kind of systematizing the common law system. And so
Mm-hmm.
he publishes a number of texts that actually become very important in the early American Republic, and get read by lawyers such
Oh
as
yeah.
John Marshall, that try to kind of systematize parts of the common law
Mm-hmm.
in a way that allows lawyers to kind of refer to sort of his Jones's work
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of singular guide to parts, important parts of the common law. And so he is a figure who is actually a kind of this this sort of transnational or trans-imperial figure who actually matters both to early American history as well as to the history of the British Empire in Asia.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was working on my first book, which dealt with American perceptions of the Muslim world, in a newspaper, and I can't remember where it was, there was fully 2 pages of an obituary of Jones, which just struck me. Here's someone I had never heard of, but he was so important that it was a longer obituary than you would have seen for Thomas Jefferson, probably, in this newspaper. And so a fascinating character, and as you say, he is important in both of these worlds. And it's really striking. Just one final thing. I know we've kept you for a while. Asheesh Kapur Siddique is our guest from the University of Massachusetts. Not far from where I'm sitting on Boston Common, there's a monument to the Boston Massacre, and has a quote on it: "From that date, we may trace the severance of the British Empire."
Yes.
And I've always found that a little doubtful. I wonder if you have any perspective on it.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we are that can kind of, especially living in Massachusetts, where the revolution always seems so so present, as is that there is a much longer history of tensions and struggles between colonists and in metropolitan administrators in the history of the 17th and 18th century British Empire. I mean, in some ways, we can even see, I think, in that often, I think, the how shall one put it, kind of the teleology of the revolution tends to obscure. So going back to the 17th century, we could also invoke things like the efforts of the Board of Trade to in the 1690s and early 1700s to try to take away a lot of colonial charters and try to say, well, you know what, these charters were given in error by oftentimes by Charles II, who's not a very popular king in by the 1690s, and to colonists in error, and that these charters gave them too much autonomy, and actually, because we are a monarchy, all of those powers should really be in the hands of the monarch and in the hands of Parliament. And so there's this longer history that oftentimes, I think, in our popular memory of the revolution, we forget about challenges and tensions within an empire over who should rule and where power should be located. And I think it's important for folks to remember this, because it helps us see that the American Revolution didn't come out ex nihilo out of nothing. It was a product of a much longer history of imperial government and of the complexities of how to run an empire in an early modern world where there's no internet, and it takes months to get a letter across the Atlantic Ocean, and a lot of these things get lost, and in which it's a very different kind of a world than which we are familiar with.
Wow, thank you. We've been talking with Asheesh Kapur Siddique from the University of Massachusetts. He has a book coming out, we hope, in the next year or so, about this issue, the relationship between archives and governance in the early modern British Empire. And of course, it focuses on some, in addition to other places, on these 13 colonies that become the United States. And he's written other things, which I could mention, but I'll put up a link and people can see. And it's been fascinating talking to you. So thank you for joining us. And
thank you so much, Bob. It was such an honor to be here.
Well, it's great. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and I want to thank our many listeners. I know Diane Gilbert from the Dartmouth Historical Trust lamented that she says she doesn't think she'll live long enough to read all of the books we talk about. But I hope she does. And it's impressive how much great work is being done in the world of history.
Yes, it's extraordinary.
And as I was saying, we have listeners really all over the world, here in and around Boston, but also in Mestobrno in the Czech Republic, and Melbourne, another far-flung part form of the British Commonwealth, and Guayaquil in Ecuador, and Hamburg in Germany, and Montclair, New Jersey, and Long Beach, California. And I want to invite listeners in any of these places to contact Jonathan Lane, jlane@masshist.org, and he'll send you one of our Revolution 250 lapel pins, and hope to connect you in this broader digital empire that we have, or I guess digital republic we would have. So thank you all for joining us, and now we'll be piped out on the road to Boston.